A little reflection on our reading, and then we'll share in our gospel reading. This week, as I was thinking about today, I remembered the first time I read the book Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Anybody read that one? It's a classic. It's an old one. And I'll tell you, I was dreading it. I absolutely did not want to read this book because I knew I was going to hate it. And here's why. When I was in 9th grade English, my class of all boys read Jane Eyre by her sister, Charlotte Bronte. And it struck me as a particularly dreadful book. Even after I knew about The Secret in the Attic, it still wasn't enough to save that book. And so when I signed up for my survival literature class in 11th grade, and Mrs. Scott said that we were going to be reading another Bronte book, I knew it was going to be awful. It was a love story. What to an 11th grade boy sounds like a good idea about that? And then I read it. More than I read it, I devoured that book. I love that book. I still love that book. I love the story. It became this incredibly powerful story to me about passion and about endurance and about love indeed, but also about character. And I love that book. I still have my copy from 11th grade. I couldn't put it down. I've read it a couple times even since. But I still remember the feeling the first time that I read Wuthering Heights. The story was so good that I couldn't just be a passive observer. I couldn't just sit there looking at the pages. I was in that story. I participated in that story, and it was very, very real to me. Even more real than any of the movie adaptations I've ever seen. That book just grabbed me. And it's always my hope for each of us, myself included, that Scripture will be this way too, that we'll have this same experience with Scripture. There are times I know when the Bible can seem like this absolutely impenetrable fortress, this undecipherable collection of what we say might be irrelevant or ancient writings, until we actually start to read it. And more than just pass our eyes over the words, but actually read it. Because that's when we discover things. We discover things like characters and questions. We discover intrigue and wonderings that can inspire and challenge us, but can also encourage us and lead us into growth patterns that we didn't even imagine. We connect with this main character, God, who is absolutely passionate about the love and the life that God lavishly shares with all of people. And we recognize we're not just passive observers. We're participants in this unfolding story. Even as we read about people in places that are long gone, we recognize that these stories include us. Scripture is our story. The people that we meet in here, they celebrate the same kinds of triumphs. They suffer the same kinds of tragedies that we do. They have their moments of great strength and faith. They have their own collections of weaknesses and failings. And we find ourselves coming to life in these pages. And throughout all this story, we receive one kind of ongoing warning. We're warned against living our lives passively. We're warned against letting whatever the prevailing currents and attitudes blow us back and forth like wind through the grass, but instead, we're led to stand strong for what's right, to counter those trends and those tendencies that lead to division and injustice among God's family, and to stand for God's command to love and to live fearlessly. We find a sense of connectedness and rootedness in Scripture when we find ourselves in the pages. And that's the story of Christ's passion. The story of these events that we remember this week. His last meal, his betrayal, arrest, and trial, his humiliation, crucifixion, and burial. This is a story about events that changed the world, yes, but even more, this is a story that changes our lives. Because if we look closely, we see ourselves in it. We find ourselves, as we did this morning, celebrating our Christ, but then eventually pointing accusing fingers. We find ourselves acting out of jealousy and fear sometimes. We find ourselves being moved back and forth by the emotion of the crowd and those around us. We find ourselves anxiously waiting and wondering to see what God will do next. We know this story. We're in this story. This story changes who we are because it shows us who we can be. Sometimes at our worst moments, other times at our best. As we read this story today, look for yourselves in it. Look for where you are. See what Jesus does, even when those closest to him turn away. Realize this is a love story, but it's a love story for all of humanity. It's a transformative story that changes the world and changes us. Let's join together in this most important story that changed history. So I invite you to take out your booklets, and as I mentioned before, you each have different parts bolded in them, and I encourage you to read boldly and clearly, and just remember that not all of us read at the same speed. So if you find yourselves 3 words ahead of everybody else, it's okay to slow down just a little bit so that we can hear these things. And just be reminded, you may have a different part than the person next to you. Don't let that discourage you. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming. The Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Now, while Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment. She poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, 'Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me.'" He answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." He replied, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night. For it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered.' But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." And he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away for the 2nd time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the Scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the Scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." But Jesus was silent. Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. At that moment, the cock crowed. After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the Field of Blood to this day. Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. Over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" At once, one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. This is the gospel of the Lord.